يا يا Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Welcome all of you in the Ziyara program for today, discussing Islamic chaplaincy and end-of-life care. To all mothers out there, today is Mother's Day, as recognized here in the US. So happy Mother's Day to all of you. I know I come from a culture that recognizes in March, but another day, another celebration. My name is Kamal Abu-Shamsieh. I'll be serving as your host today. Would like to begin by thanking the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley for giving opportunity and partnership with Ziyara Spiritual Care. I serve as the director of the Interreligious Chaplaincy Program at the Graduate Theological Union, assistant professor of practical theology. Ziyara is a organization that we established about 10 years ago with the goal of sharing what Islamic chaplaincy means, looks like, training and education in the US and across the Arab and Muslim world. We have been in many countries, led training in Indonesia. We had last year a half unit of clinical pastoral education, CPE, in Malaysia. We trained in Saudi Arabia, actually across the Arab countries. And today we are doing this program for two goals. The first one is to share with those who don't know what resources we have available here in terms of Islamic chaplaincy, to share these resources, also to present a pathway for encouraging Muslims to join the field of chaplaincy. We have an extreme shortage of Muslim chaplains. At the same time, we would like to share our understanding and perspectives and engage with you on what it means to have an Islamic perspective on chaplaincy and field question and answers. We have three speakers for today. We will begin by Chaplain Sundus Khulaqi, who will give a theological foundation on chaplaincy from a Muslim perspective. We have Rami Salah, a palliative care specialist, who will share goals of care and end-of-life care. And we have Chaplain Sakina Al-Habshi, who will be sharing the educational pathways or the making of a chaplain.
Thank you so much, Kamal. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, alhamdulillah. Let me share my screen really quickly. Okay. Is that clear? All right.
Yes.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Thank you, Kamal, and thank you, Ziyara, and the whole team for hosting this really important event. As Kamal mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about spiritual care and chaplaincy from an Islamic perspective, or rooted in Islamic theology. So for Muslims, we derive our teachings from two main sources, our guidance from two main sources. One is the Quran, which is the scriptural text of Muslims. It is considered the verbatim word of God. And the Sunnah, or the life teachings and example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who is also referred to in the Quran as, or in our tradition, as the walking Quran, in that he embodies the principles and the teachings and the love and the compassion in the Quran in his life. And so we take from these two, we have the text, and then we have the human being who models for us how the text is supposed to be manifested in our life. And as a Muslim chaplain, as a Muslim spiritual caregiver, I draw from these two sources to inform my ministry. And I serve, by the way, as a hospital chaplain in Orange County and in Los Angeles. So both God in the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, emphasize one key characteristic, which is rahmah in Arabic. And rahmah is often translated to mercy or love or compassion. God is often referred to as Ar-Rahman Rahim. And then we have the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who is referred to by God in the Quran as Rahmatan lil Alamin. And I'll break those down soon, but I want to point your attention to the word of Arabic rahmah, whose root letters are RHM, which interestingly is the same letters and roots in the word rahim or womb, the womb of a mother, which is very fitting for today, which is Mother's Day. So if we look at this name, this beautiful attribute of God as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful, the all-loving, it is actually in Arabic a feminine attribute, and it links directly to this idea of Rahim or the womb, which is the cushioned home of the growing fetus within the mother. So in this way, we're elevating this attribute of God as a protective, nurturing, and loving nature of the divine. So he protects us and nurtures us unconditionally, and he remains present with us before we are even in the care of our guardians or our parents or our own mother and father. And in the hospital, I actually find it very notable that many patients who are coming out of surgery or in a lot of pain or on their deathbed will actually cry out for their mother, no matter how old they are and whether their mother is alive or dead. So I wonder about the comfort of this idea of a mother's love or a parent's love being the closest thing that we have here on earth to understanding God's love for us. And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is nicknamed or is referred to as Rahmatan lil Alamin, which means the mercy to all of humanity, mercy to all of creations. So he, peace and blessings be upon him, is my model for caregiving, for chaplaincy. The way that he served everybody in his community and in his surroundings and his midst, from the most vulnerable and needy to the most powerful. His primary characteristics was mercy, love, compassion, and leniency and gentleness. And this is what I try to embody in my ministry as a chaplain. In a stunning description of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, it says he was always happy and easy-mannered. There was always a smile and a sign of happiness on his blessed face. He was soft-natured, and when people needed his approval, he easily gave consent. He did not speak in a harsh tone, nor was he stone-hearted. He did not raise his voice while speaking, nor was he rude or spoke indecently. And this is the way that many Muslims remember the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, as a gentle, loving, and merciful example who embodied these Quranic teachings of spiritual advancement, spiritual purification, which I think very appropriately fits the characteristics of a chaplain and a spiritual caregiver. So if we're looking at chaplaincy from these two sources, from the foundations, let's look at the Sunnah or the life of the Prophet first. Prophetic chaplaincy emerges as a recurring theme in the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And I could spend an entire presentation on just this one slide, but for the sake of time, I'll just briefly run through a few examples of the way that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, embodies this role of chaplain or spiritual caregiver. Many Muslims are familiar with the way that the Prophet provided active listening to anybody who was speaking to him. It says in our tradition that he used to face the person who was speaking to him with his entire body, in a way that he was so present to them that they felt like they were the most important person in that moment to him. And there are many narrations that capture that feeling from the care seeker. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was known to put the care seeker's needs first. There's a beautiful narration or hadith about a woman who came to the Prophet And it says in many narrations that she was somebody who was carrying a heavy burden, and that quite possibly she also had a mental illness. And she came to the Prophet seeking his presence. And she said, I need to spend time with you. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, at this point in his life was a leader, a state leader, a governor, a prophet, a father, a family man. I mean, he had many, many roles. And the beautiful response that he gave this woman was, choose any street in Medina, in the city of Medina, and I will come sit with you. So always putting other people's needs first. Another beautiful story that I love to repeat is that when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, took somebody's hand in a handshake, he was never the first person to draw his hand back first. And this to me really symbolizes and epitomizes this idea of letting the other person take exactly what they need from him, and then they will be the ones to dictate when they are done. His gentle guidance, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, we have many examples of the ways in which he guides those who come to him for advice or guidance with a series of questions. That he sees the potential in the care seeker for being able to figure out and know what it is that they need, and yet he just gently guides them with a few questions. And this is very much in the spirit of a chaplain and a spiritual caregiver. And also that he was aware of people's stages of faith. And this is something that we learn about as well in our chaplaincy training and education, that there's different guidance for different people according to what stage and phase they are in life, psychologically, socially, spiritually. And we know that, for example, there are many narrations of people asking him the same question, and yet he would give slightly different answers to each person depending on where they were, that he had that emotional intelligence to be able to see that in different people. We see many instances of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, embody this role of advocate, which is also something that the chaplain, part of the chaplain's function and their role. And a beautiful story of his, one of his wives, Sophia, who came from a Jewish tribe, who was being bullied by other women and other wives who were really jealous of her and just keep pointing out the fact that she came from a different tribe. And Sophia came to the Prophet, upset and hurt by this. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, not only advocated for her and let the others know that this was absolutely unacceptable behavior, but he also equipped her with a sentence to say, if anybody should repeat that to her again, something akin to, my father is Abraham, my uncle is Moses, and my husband is Muhammad, thereby underscoring and emphasizing the link, the common spiritual ancestry link between all of the women. So in this way, he didn't just advocate for the person in their presence, but also he equipped them with what they need so that they can advocate for themselves in his absence. And this is something else that a spiritual caregiver or a chaplain aims to do for the care seeker, whether it's a patient or a student on campus, etc. And he was a model of somebody who really took care of himself in a way that we really need to abide by in these times. He used to split up his day in thirds, 1/3 for family and self, 1/3 for God and worship, and 1/3 for his work. We have many, many traditions and narrations about the way that he adhered to nutritional principles, how it's the sunnah or the way of the Prophet to remain just a little bit hungry, which I'm sure many Muslims are feeling right now as we're fasting. His way of exercising, and his way of emphasizing being in nature, and that there's something really powerfully healing in being in nature. And the last slide that I have, yes, so we'll end here, is prophetic chaplaincy in the Quran. So we saw, from the two main sources, we have the Quran and the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. We saw the way that chaplaincy emerges in the life of the Prophet and the way he embodies that. And now from the Quran, there is a chapter in the Quran that speaks directly about a story that from the life of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him receiving revelation. So the first time that the angel Gabriel comes to the Prophet Muhammad and tells him to read or recite revelation or Quran. And the way that the story is told in different ways, at least the the common narration is that he is absolutely jarred by this experience, very much startled by it. And he runs to his wife, Khadija, and he tells her, Khadija, to cover me, to wrap me in his cloak, kind of self-prescribing what he needs in that moment, feeling really startled by this experience, by this mystical, supernatural experience. And Khadija, in many chaplains' estimations, is the first Muslim chaplain after this idea of him receiving revelation, because she takes the cloak, which interestingly, chaplain, the word chaplain, the Latin word means cloak. And so this idea of this, that the emergence of the cloak in the Islamic tradition is very, very significant. So she takes the cloak and she wraps him, and she provides him this comfort. And then what does she do next? She affirms his good qualities. She says, you were a good person, you were honest, you were there to help the needy. She reminds him of all of the things, his characteristics that were really beautiful. And then she makes an assessment. And she intervenes by then realizing her limits and saying, I'm going to take you to my cousin, Waraka, who is a Christian monk, and he might have some answers for us about what just happened. So she refers out. So all of these points and all of these actions that she did are very, very similar to what we as chaplains do as well. And so there's this beautiful chapter in the Quran that talks about that very story, that very instant, where God tells us, oh, you wrapped in your cloak, referring to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, arise and give caution, time to get to work, right? Chaplain is a guide. Now your work begins. Proclaim the greatness of your Lord, remind people of God, cleanse yourself. Very much a part of chaplaincy in our education and training is this idea of our own self-work and our own heart work, our own purification. There's this cleansing that we need to do internally to empty ourselves in order to create space for other people. And uncleanliness avoid. I see that as live ethically and morally and beautifully as much as possible. Do not be overwhelmed and weaken. In other words, self-care, and be steadfast in your Lord's cause. So loyalty and dedication to this idea of loving and serving God's creation. So I will pause here and hand it back to Kamal, and then we can have more discussion, hopefully, in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sundus. That was beautiful. We will have question and answer at the end of the program with all the speakers. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rami Salah. Actually, Rami, why don't you introduce yourself and take it away?
There we go. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be unto all of you. Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful day of Mother's Day to learn a little bit about the Islamic perspectives on this such an important topic. I'm a palliative care doctor out of San Mateo, California. I'm mostly home-based. I also do some inpatient work as well. And this has always been a passion of mine. It's probably no surprise that I ended up in palliative care because of my interests in my own spirituality and faith practice. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a lot of things today, and my objective are two. It's not to impart knowledge or to make sure people are taking notes. It's really to pique an interest in you, maybe stir something within you about this topic. And more importantly, to really highlight and underscore the important role chaplains play in healthcare. So I'll talk about what palliative care is, what it is we do. I'll also introduce a case and introduce the concept of Islamic bioethics through that case. And then last but not least, talk about grief, just briefly. So palliative care, and Sundus, it's amazing. I feel like I learned so much from you and from others. Palliative is also a word that's derived from the word cloak, pallium. If anyone knows the Pope's pallium, and I look at it just like the way Khadija wrapped and comforted the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, And I often introduce this to patients, just like a cloak. We're here to keep you warm when it's cold, and to conceal and hopefully alleviate some of the suffering you're feeling from your illness. Palliative care, because it's such an odd word, is very misunderstood. So to introduce it the way the Center to Advance Palliative Care introduces it, it's a specialty in medicine for people with serious illness, and there's a broad range in terms of how people define serious illness, but the main goal is to improve the quality of life for both the patient and their loved ones. I often say there are 3 buckets of palliative care: symptom management, like pain management, for example; support, be it psychosocial, spiritual, and emotional support; and then, of course, something we call goals of care, learning about the person that we're treating so that the care that they get matches the care that they'd want. It's important to know that palliative care is not synonymous with end-of-life care. It can be offered at any age and any stage, hand in hand with curative treatments as well, and is really dependent on the needs of the person and not necessarily the prognosis or life expectancy. These are the 8 domains of palliative care, and I'm not going to read them out for you, but know that no domain is inherently more important than the other. It all depends on the person we're treating and their needs, as well as where they are in their course of the disease, the trajectory of the disease and life. So if symptoms, pain is their main concern, physical pain, then maybe that physical domain becomes, more important, more weighted. Social aspects, all these different domains are so important. And this is where I introduce the concept of a palliative care team. In my opinion, any palliative care team that's missing a doctor or a nurse or a social worker, and of course a chaplain, is thereby deficient, right? We try to do our best, for example, even as a doctor, to do a spiritual care screening. But to provide spiritual care and helping a person with, say, existential or spiritual suffering, we need a chaplain on the team. So it is best delivered, and I say that it's only delivered the way that it's meant to, when we have these disciplines represented. One more word on palliative care before we move forward. Every other specialty, almost every other specialty in medicine, it requires a step in. And it's synonymous with a more narrow field of vision, right? Cardiologists take a step in and look at the heart, and nephrologists take a step in and look at the kidneys. Palliative care specialists actually take a step back, and that's why it's sometimes harder to define, right? We want to know what's inside the patient, the disease that's taking them. We also want to know what's behind the patient. What are their experiences with illnesses for themselves or for their loved ones in the past? We want to look ahead in front of the patient. What are their hopes and worries for the future? Who is around the patient? Who are the important people that they surround themselves with? What is the ground that they're standing on? What's underneath the patient? Their housing, their financial situation. And of course, what's above the patient? What is their spirituality and faith practice? And how does that intersect with things like goals of care and the medical treatments that they're receiving? So now let's shift gears, and I want to bring forward to you a case, and this was a real case that I was involved in. This was a 70-year-old Muslim woman. She was on a flight from the Middle East to the Bay Area, and she developed respiratory distress, trouble breathing in flight, and was rushed over to the emergency room as soon as she touched down, and was found to have undiagnosed leukemia. And this type of leukemia, the blood cells get so big in the blood vessels that they can clog them up and cause organ damage. And her lungs were failing because of it. And so she was on something called BiPAP, which is a step before intubation and ventilators. I know this has become common speak over the last year and a half with COVID, but intubation was imminent because she was unable to breathe on her own. And so the palliative care team was consulted to help with what's called goals of care, figure out what's important for the patient. Now, the son that I met was a practicing doctor, radiologist in Saudi Arabia who flew over, and a family meeting was held. And the idea of intubation came up and code status, to which he exclaimed, "In my religion, we do everything. If we have to intubate, than intubate. Now, I'll come back to this case in a bit, but I just want to highlight some important things that Muslims and Muslim patients go through when they are ill and when they are in the hospital. Number one, there's a level of mistrust. Just like many other racial and ethnic minorities, interfacing with healthcare founded on racist practices and implicit biases, there is a level of mistrust from the Muslim community when it comes to healthcare, and something that I encounter. I don't want to stereotype my whole community, but there have been many instances, and as a doctor and as a Muslim from a Muslim family, that there's some work to be done in terms of emotional processing, right? Even for those that are maybe don't identify as strongly religious or practicing Muslims, when they are at the end of life and these decisions, medical decisions, are life and death, the duties to God are amplified. A word on imams. Imams are community leaders. They teach Quran, they teach religion, they hold marriage ceremonies, funeral processions, and all that they hold. And many times Muslim families and patients turn to them for medical advice around intubation and CPR and withdrawal of life support. And it's like, my goodness, how much can an imam hold? I remember holding a talk at a mosque around advanced care planning, and the imam raised his hand and he said, what do I tell a person in this situation? And I think it's just way too big of a burden and way too much to hold for an imam. And then last but not least, there is, in my humble opinion, an overemphasis on a legalistic approach. And what I mean by that, what's forbidden in Islam and what's allowed in Islam. And this black and white kind of approach does not fit, and I think does a disservice to many patients who are dealing with serious illness. So let's talk about the legal approach just for a second. Many Muslim majority countries, many councils have come up with legal rulings called fatwa to help, I guess, address the idea of withholding and withdrawing life support. And there was a study right there at the bottom of the screen that you can see and that you can read that put it together on a table among different councils here in the States and worldwide. And I don't think any were as clear, maybe specific is the right word, as this committee in Saudi Arabia, where they said that if a patient was unfit for resuscitation, if 3 trustworthy doctors deemed that a disease is unresponsive to treatment and death is certain, or there's a state of mental inactivity or untreatable brain damage, or resuscitation would be ineffective in the minds of those 3 doctors, well then they can withhold and withdraw life support. And the fatwa goes on to say, nor is there a need to turn to the opinions of the patient's family regarding this decision, for they're not qualified to make such decisions. Now, the idea of paternalism and autonomy, that's a whole different discussion. I just want to present it as one of the ways a legal counsel in a Muslim majority country addressed this topic. Now, the legal approach, like I said, focuses on what we can and can't do. And I think we need to take it from an ethical standpoint, what you should and shouldn't do. And I think that allows for more nuance. And I do think that patients are better and families are better served with that approach. So I just want to present to you this slide comparing Western bioethics and Islamic bioethics. To start with Western bioethics, the guidance of it all is that it's person-centered. And for that reason, autonomy is king, right? Informed consent, making sure a person has that right. And this was over dozens of cases, especially in the 20th century, talking about informed consent and autonomy, went up to the Supreme Court to make it so. And so these are the 4, by the way, medical ethics that we learn in medical school. And autonomy is right there on top from a Western standpoint. Non-maleficence, doing no harm, is obviously very important. Beneficence, doing good, and collective justice is another guiding principle. In Islamic bioethics, what's really highlighted is duties and obligations. Duties and obligations to God, duties and obligations to society, to your community, family, to yourself, and to your body, right? And that's why Islam, coming from the word submit, submitting to something greater than yourself. Now, there isn't a list of 4 or 5 principles the way there are in Western medical ethics, but contemporary bioethicists, and thank God for them, they've been doing amazing work over the last 2 decades, instead have looked at these 4 principles through the Islamic lens and said, okay, all 4 have very strong evidence for them in the Islamic tradition, but the weight of each one might be a little different. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was quoted to have said, there shall be no harm inflicted nor reciprocated in Islam. And ethicists, not just bioethicists, but social ethicists and financial ethicists, take that as the paramount principle, doing no harm. Justice and the public interest actually taking precedence over the private interest if they are at conflict or at odds with one another is an important principle as well. Beneficence is something strongly rooted in all faith traditions, right? To do good and be good. And last but not least, definitely not least, is autonomy. And autonomy is important in the Islamic tradition. I'll just mention this quick story to highlight it. But in the Prophet's, Muhammad's, peace and blessings be upon him, last days, he was suffering from high fevers. It sounded like an some kind of an infection that he was going through. And he was in and out of consciousness, something that we call terminal delirium, falling asleep, waking up, arousing. And in one of those instances, his family, and it can mirror many of the scenes that I see in the hospital today, were wondering, what do we do? What do we do? How can we help him? How can we cure him? And so one of them had Indian incense, and this is 7th century Arabia, just thought to help with some sort of infection, and tried to insert it into his mouth. And he kind of refused and said, no, no, while he was conscious enough to do so. But then he fell out of consciousness, and they placed it into his mouth, of course, and just trying to grasp at anything that might help the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. But when he came to and he woke up with this medicine in his buccal cavity or in his mouth, he was angry and upset and scolded them for doing so. And from that story, ethicists take to say that autonomy is very important and is in fact part of the Sunnah, the Islamic and prophetic tradition that we follow and hold in such high regard. So just a story to highlight the importance of autonomy and a patient's right to choose their medical treatments. So how did this case play out? So I actually brought up this fatwa from Saudi Arabia with the patient's son. And he said, look, I'm the doctor in the family, and I don't want to be the one seen as the one who decided our mother should die. And immediately, I was just humbled. Here I was with my hat as a man who's interested in Islamic bioethics and reads a bit and was trying to go with that approach when really I should have been wearing the hat of palliative care clinician the entire time. This man was grieving. And even though he mentioned in my religion we intubate, right? That was coming from an emotional place. And so it behooves us to address the emotions before engaging with patients and their families cognitively or intellectually, right? Muslims are humans, is what I'm saying, and Muslims grieve like humans, and Muslims need the spiritual care, the emotional care, just like all humans do. So just to touch on grief, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, grieved, and he was met with many instances of grief in his life. And one that gets me emotional when I think about it is that of grieving the death of his son, Ibrahim. And Ibrahim was about 1.5 years. And when he heard the news that he was falling ill and he was soon to die, he rushed back home and placed his infant son on his lap, and he began weeping. And his companion was with him, Ibn Auf, by the name of Ibn Auf. And he said, and you, O Messenger of God, you cry? See, it was looked down upon for men to cry, and especially in public at that time, probably still is in some circles. And he looked at his companion, the Prophet looked at his companion and said, "Oh, Ibn Auf, this is mercy." And he begins to weep some more. And he said, "The eye sheds tears and the heart is grieved, and we don't say except which is pleasing to our Lord." And then he calls out to his dead son, "And we are grieved by your separation, O Ibrahim." We have probably been exposed to the 5 stages of dying and how people apply it to their grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. To introduce it to those who are not familiar, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a psychiatrist, I think in the 60s and 70s, and she was well ahead of her time. She did some of the first research on emotions around death and dying. And she coined these stages, dabda. And it's referenced many times in pop culture, in medicine as well. But it's so interesting how this woman's research in the 70s and how the experience of the Prophet's death in his community 1400 years prior line up so perfectly. And I want to use the story of Omar. And Omar was a very, very, very close companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He was a very strong man, strong physically, strong in his presence. People noticed when he walked into a room. And because he was so strong in his conviction and his love for God, his faith, and of course the Prophet Muhammad, his companion, he was also, you can say, pretty fiery, maybe short-tempered in a lot of instances that we read about in the Prophet's life. And so when the news of the Prophet's death hits the ears of Omar, he immediately, right outside the Prophet's home, among all the people, brandishes his sword. And he's angry. He says, "Some of the hypocrites allege that the messenger of God is dead." And he's in denial. By Allah, he is not dead. And he's bargaining. He's only gone to his Lord just as Moses did for 40 days. He's coming back, right? To extrapolate that and put it into a modern sense, I see this all the time from all patients, from all walks of life, right? Oh, it's not cancer. They picked up something else on the scan. Anger. Oh, too many conflicts between a patient and their loved ones, between, say, the children of the patients. I've been kicked out of rooms before, taking it out on house staff in the hospital. And of course, bargaining. Oh, no, this doctor doesn't know what she's talking about. We need to go to Stanford or UCSF to seek 3rd and 4th and 5th medical opinions. Now, as the story goes, Abu Bakr, who was another close companion, emerges from the Prophet's home after saying goodbye to the Prophet. And he's could be introduced as a more, like I said, even-keeled. And he tried to calm Omar down. And he was unsuccessful. So he did something very uncharacteristic of himself. Abu Bakr speaks over Omar. And in a very famous quote that many Muslims know, he says, "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead, and whoever worships Allah, know that Allah is ever living." And he recites a verse from the Holy Quran that says, "And Muhammad is not but a messenger, and messengers have passed before him." On reflecting on this moment, many of the companions present actually said that it felt like they heard that verse for the very first time, even though they've heard it before. And Omar, years later, in his own reflection about this instant, said, "By Allah, as soon as I heard Abu Bakr recite it, my legs betrayed me so that I collapsed to the floor." Here is Omar, a lion of a man, breaking down. Depression. I knew then that the messenger of Allah had indeed died. The 5 stages of grief. And I bring this up to many presentations that I have in the Muslim community for a couple of reasons. Number one, if Omar in his faith, and of course the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and the status that he has in our religion, if they weren't safe from feeling these emotions, from grieving when they were met with death, who are we not to, right? Of course we're going to feel it. Number two is, unfortunately, in healthcare, doctors, clinicians, and in the teams that are present, we are not equipped to process families' emotions when they're met with bad news. In fact, we take the approach of saying, okay, here's this bad news, this prognosis or diagnosis, or something we picked up on the data that we're collecting. Now, what is your decision, right? Comfort care or CPR or hospice or chemotherapy or all these big decisions that come up. meanwhile bypassing the person that we're treating in front of us and what's important to them and all the emotional whirlwind that they're probably in. And that's all to say that if there is any inkling in you to help and provide spiritual care, to become chaplains like the luminous faces that I'm sharing the virtual stage with today, it is so needed. It is so needed for our patients. And just like Omar relied on the Quran to help him get to that acceptance phase, as can Muslims. In verses like these, we will certainly test you with a touch of fear and famine and loss of property, life, and crops, to give good news to those who patiently endure, who, when faced with a disaster, say, surely to Allah we belong, and to Him we shall return. Thank you all, and now I'll turn it back to Kamal, and I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any in the Q&A. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Rami, for this precious and generous presentation and of your time as well. We have a few questions that came up in the chat. We will review them and we will answer them at the end of the program. Next, I would like to introduce Chaplain Sakina Al-Habshi, who will be sharing the pathways for education or the making of a chaplain. Sakina.
Assalamu alaikum, peace to all of you. You see the slides? Okay, all right. So my presentation is going to focus a little bit more on how you might want to be, how you might want to begin or continue your path to chaplaincy. This might not be applicable to some of you who may already be chaplains in the audience, and to others. We are encouraging, I think chaplaincy is a field that still feels a little hidden, and people are not quite aware on how do you even begin to become a chaplain. Do you need to have already a whole bunch of religious background and things like that? So we'll share a little bit of that. And before I go into the technicalities, I'd like to use myself as a case study and share my path briefly of how I came into this work, this calling, this passion. In my earlier days, I was an undergrad in engineering. So I did engineering, I worked in the oil and gas industry for about 10 years in Malaysia. And I was always studying Islamic studies along the way and volunteering with interfaith work and hospice and counseling and things like that as a volunteer basis. And along the way, I began to take it more seriously. And I was looking for something to transition, really. I wanted to leave my corporate work and do all the things that were giving me life through my volunteer work in a more structured, professional, full-time manner. And in 2017, I resigned from my job. I was helping to care for my father who was unwell, my grandfather who was unwell, my best friend who had cancer at stage 4. And it was around that time that I met Kamal. He was in Malaysia. He was giving a talk on spirituality in medicine in one of the hospitals that I volunteered at, much like this big auditorium in the photo. And at the end of his talk, which was a lot of similar to what we discussed here today, I felt this was exactly all the things that I loved and called to me. And I was interested in finding out more. So, but I was also, my father was unwell, still taking care of them and with my mom. And in 2018, in April, just 2 weeks after I attended my first official spiritual care chaplaincy talk, my father passed away. And it was Ramadan soon after that. And in Ramadan, just like right now, in the last week of Ramadan was when I called Kamal to find out more about this path. And so Ramadan has a special meaning to me as sort of like the gateway to this new phase of my life, this new chapter of my life. And Kamal also shared his own personal experiences of his family loss and how that's driven his passion for this field. And I found out about Ziyara, I found out about ACPE. I already had a diploma in Islamic studies and decided that this was a path that I wanted to step into more formally in applied to come into the US for my clinical pastoral education residency at Stanford. I'm not sure the Stanford logo is not coming up there. So that was my pathway to this field now. I'm currently at Stanford as a chaplain fellow. I'm hoping, inshallah, to pursue my path into CPE educator training to be able to train other chaplains. And so what I will share now actually is a few of the many pathways to professional chaplaincy, because it's not everybody comes in the same way. So these are some of the ways. This is not all the ways. It's not all inclusive. There may be some of you who are chaplains who have become chaplains through different pathways, but we tried to kind of see what would be like the most general path that fits the current structure of education and professional training. So a lot of people start getting interested in this field because they were volunteers, like me. I was volunteering in related fields and I had some experience. Some chaplains come in from completely different career education. Chaplain Taqwa on screen, she was an architect. I was an engineer. Sunda's undergrad was in creative writing, right, Sundus? English and creative writing. So Kamal was a documentary filmmaker. Not everybody comes in with Islamic studies from the beginning of their life, but it's probably already been alongside your path. Maybe like I have done some formal education and also informal studies in Islamic studies, and that's already there as a base. To go into professional chaplaincy, you would need a graduate level religious education. So like a master's in divinity or a master's in Islamic studies. And usually these programs, these master's programs or the MDiv programs will have 1 unit of clinical pastoral education requirement as part of the training. This is where you will be stationed in a hospital. The training will be done in a hospital. And it is, it's sort of a practical component that goes alongside your theoretical studies. And I've benefited greatly from this process. It uses the reflective practice methodology, I would say similar to Islamic, the muraqabah, muhasabah, tazkiyatun nafs, the awareness and the refinement of ourselves, understanding ourselves. We work alongside trained supervisors. We work with patients, care seekers. We work in a group of peers of maybe say 4 to 8 people. It's sort of like you have your group of Sahaba who are undergoing this training together with you, supervised clinically, and you share your case studies, you share your interactions with patients, you get feedback on yourself, your growth, you work on your self-awareness. And that's sort of in a nutshell what the CPE education is about. So like I said, most of these programs in the large seminaries here would require 1 unit of CPE for you to complete. And if you're interested in healthcare chaplaincy, what usually happens is after 1 unit of CPE, one might feel that this is something that they really are interested in more and could go into taking a residency program, which would be 4 units, about a year roughly, at one of the hospitals that have the CPE training. And from the residency program, you could continue on a fellowship and have specific specialization. I'm currently completing my ICU, intensive care unit fellowship. And then future on the career path, there's a path to board certification or if you're interested in being a CPE educator. For the other 2 logos that are not showing up here, I have the Association of Muslim Chaplains. That's an association that covers healthcare chaplaincy, corrections, prison chaplaincy, campus university chaplaincy. All of the chaplains across the US can be a member of the Association of Muslim Chaplains for support for continuing education. The Wellspring Chaplaincy Initiative is an initiative that supports CPE students. So they would support your CPE fees, and that's their specific focus in supporting students who are interested in CPE through fees and some education as well. And the logo at the bottom is the Muslim Endorsement Council. So moving on for like next steps, if you're interested in board certification or educator training, there is an endorsement process that goes through the Muslim Endorsement Council. Let's see. So the question I get sometimes is like, why is the process so long? Aren't you all just visiting patients? You know, why do you need 2-3 degrees and thousands of hours in a hospital for training? And I want to go back to what I just told Rami's slide again here. This is a big obligation. It's a serious obligation and duty. And just as in the medical field in Islam, the priority is la darar wa la dirar. We are not wanting to cause harm on others and harm on ourselves. Spiritual malpractice, emotional, mental malpractice, and harm to others and ourselves is the minimum to avoid. So the training and the practice and the supervision and doing that in a group, continuous learning and growth is important. I'm not saying that volunteers don't do a good job when they're visiting patients. It's a different scope. It's a different scope. The way we talk about it at Stanford is like we have spiritual care generalists who may have some level of knowledge and awareness practice, and then the spiritual care specialists. So that's a whole different level, and why the training reflects such. And yeah, okay. I will stop for now, and I think we'll go with the Q&A, and there might be further questions about the process, and we can discuss it over there.
Thank you so much, Sakina. We will be having the question and answer indeed. We have a few questions that are in the chat. We will ask Dr. Rami, Sundus, and Sakina to go over the chat and pick questions, and encourage all of you to write or type your question in the chat. Just two quick things about Ziyara. As a nonprofit organization, if you enjoy what you are listening today, we would love to have your support, and also financial support if possible. We have a Lunch Good campaign that is happening now, and if Taqwa can share the link again in the chat, that will be greatly appreciated. The second thing is we are distributing the Book of the Quran to hospitals across the US. If you are a chaplain in a spiritual care department in a hospital that you would like to receive a copy of the Quran, we have two copies that we can share with you. One is in Arabic and English meanings of it or translation, and that oftentimes goes to Muslim patients because they have the Arabic portion of it, and there is one in English only, and that can be given to anyone. Those are free of charge, given by Ziyara. We humbly ask you to cover the shipping costs, and I will put my email in the chat for anyone who would like to receive that. Also, it will be on the Ziyara website, which will type that in the chat. Let's move on to the question and answer. Rami, Sundus, or Sakina, any questions that you see in the chat to answer?
This is Taqwa. Assalamualaikum, everyone. I'm monitoring the chat. There is a question for Rami.
Would you like to read the question, Taqwa?
Okay. Can you talk about DNR for end-stage cancer patients, especially at hospice? Is it personal choice and or more harm and stress to patient and staff?
Yeah, I can talk about that. It's a big question, and there are a lot of things that go into that. And unfortunately, I mean, it is unfortunate. I think that there is a lot of focus on this decision. Just to highlight a story, I remember having this family meeting of a patient who was no longer a candidate for a liver transplant and therefore would be likely dying in days to weeks. And we had this family meeting with the liver transplant team and the palliative care team, and tears and grief and sadness. And we made a decision for the patient, and the teams, came to a decision of comfort care and focusing on comfort. And the transplant team left, palliative care team, as we usually do, stay to help support and process. And then the one member of the team comes back and just barges in as there's still tears and says, "Oh, and by the way, if you code and your heart stops, we're not going to be doing CPR." It's like, oh gosh, no, there's so much emphasis on getting an order in the chart around DNR that I think it loses a lot of what we do, right? So DNR orders for patients at the end of life, I think, are important and should be had. The default here in this system, for better or for worse, is to do CPR. If a DNR order isn't present, and it's usually honored by a pink form called a POLST, and every different state has its different version, but it's usually in this hot, ugly pink color to capture somebody's attention. And it's because the outcomes and the harm that's provided to a patient who is dying with CPR tend to outweigh the benefits. It is a choice. For patients on hospice, having a full code, meaning having CPR done, should not be a barrier for enrolling in hospice. It's maybe contradicts some of the philosophy of hospice, being comfort focused, but it's not necessarily a hard barrier to it. So it's a discussion that I have over multiple meetings with my patients. I can take 3, 4, 5 visits, and I usually take the approach of, not maybe necessarily the fatwa of Saudi Arabia, where I don't inform the patient and talk about it, but I center it not necessarily on medical outcomes. I center it on the person. What makes life worth living for them, what their hopes and worries are about death or about their life when they look ahead, and then ask for permission to make a recommendation, and then make a recommendation using my own clinical judgment and having gotten to know them as a person. So that's my approach to DNR orders. I know that was a mouthful, but I hope I addressed the question.
Thank you, Rami. The next question still, I'll read this and maybe others can decide. What suggestions and ideas do you have for healthcare systems to better care for Islamic patients other than educate staff chaplains and promote cultural and religious sensitivity among spiritual health providers? This is from Tim. The question is from Tim. Sundas?
Sure. I guess my question to Tim would be, why discount those two very, very important pieces of the puzzle, which is cultural humility, I would say, and also educating hospital staff. I think those pieces are key. In chaplaincy, we have extensive training wherein we are taught never to assume anything about a patient, even one who shares our faith tradition, but rather we come in open and curious to learn. We listen to understand and not to respond, and really putting, again, the care seeker's needs first, and being able to facilitate the resources that they themselves need and what we think, and as opposed to what we think they would need. So I think that those two, although they're probably very common as an answer and repeated over and over, I don't see it happening enough across hospitals in a way that is systematic. In fact, many friends of mine who are nurses and who are Muslim, who will take maybe a cultural competency class as part of their overall curriculum and coursework, are generally appalled at the texts and the information that are present for Muslim patients that contradict a lot of things that we know personally about the faith and about our people. So we have a long way to go. If those answers aren't comprehensive or enough, I would say then maybe if there is a sizable Muslim population in the hospital, consider hiring a Muslim chaplain who is qualified and who has all of the education and training that Sakina beautifully walked us through, in a way that will fulfill the needs of those patients hospital-wide. And if the hospital or spiritual care department is not equipped to hire somebody on staff, then at the very least have a chaplain who does feel comfortable doing interfaith work, multi-faith work, to be able to work with the surrounding community, the local mosque, the local Muslim organizations, to be able to facilitate visitations or whatever else they need from that community, to work as a partnership there and to build bridges between the two. So that's my 2 cents, but I'll hand you over to Sakina and see if she has anything.
I echo what you said, and just going back to the focus of the ability to really approach each person and each patient somewhat uniquely, and what are their needs and their understanding, and connecting them to the right resources if it's not present in that hospital.
Okay. I will continue with the questions after that. What is the general Muslim attitude about medical aid in dying?
I guess I can answer it. I'll start. I actually gave a presentation on this to the Association of Muslim Chaplains back in January. And I did a small research project among Muslim chaplains looking at this question. In general, and I like that you included that word, in general, it is something that's looked at as contradictory to the beliefs and tenets of Islam. That being said, there's so much nuance for patients that are requesting this, and that have I see myself as a longitudinal companion more than a doctor across the trajectory of their illness, and the feelings of abandonment if I were to shut off and say, oh, no, I don't do that, nor do I think it's ethical or moral or appropriate or what have you. So I've found my own personal way of navigating that and supporting that and making sure I have the resources available to that person should medical aid in dying come up and be pursued. But as far as the Islamic tradition and the teachings, as far as we understand them right now, I feel comfortable in saying this from my standpoint, don't allow for that process to be played out.
The next question, my question in this context, talking about spirituality, are we practicing it interchangeably within the religious principles, or this is something goes broader and wide spectrum? If so, then what do you suggest as an appropriate approach? This is question from Mus'ab Al-Dari. Are we practicing spirituality interchangeably within the religious principles, or there is something else broader? Who wants to try to tackle answering this part? Kamal?
It is not one approach that will fit every context in chaplaincy. It, as Rami mentioned, is, and actually what Sundus mentioned in the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is what are the needs of the individual? So when we look at spiritual care in general, it can be religious support. That means it is theological, it is rituals, it is prayers, but also it can be spiritual that looks upon meaning, looks upon existential threats and reflections. So it's a wide range of services, wide range of support that we offer as chaplains. It all depends on the needs of that particular individual when we meet them at that particular time.
The next question is a follow-up questions to Rami. The patient's son you talk about said that his religion wants everything to be done. So in the DNR questions, is there a religious conflict?
A good question. I should have qualified, I guess, the stance that I brought up. There are two things that I think, at least from the research, drove some of that conversation about it being contrary to Islamic belief and tradition. Number one is God's decree on life and death, is something that mirrors many other faith practices too. And secondly is the intention. The intention is something very important in Islam. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was quoted to have said that actions are judged by their intentions. And so if the intention is to cause death, that's where the hiccup is, or the discomfort, maybe I should say, is if it is supporting a person as they are dying and as the natural process plays out. I think that's two different things. To add a little bit more nuance in the conversation, if anyone's familiar with the principle of double effect, which is found in Catholic doctrine and as well as just Western ethics, where an action or a treatment or a procedure is provided with good intention to relieve suffering, for example, and an unintended consequences is one that is negative. Unintended consequence is one that is negative. Say, for example, treating a person's breathlessness at the end of life with morphine, which theoretically can hasten death, that is acceptable because of the intention. And in Islam, qasd, which is intention, mirrors that of double effect. And I find, again, personal opinion here and humble opinion, room to work in that, to provide patients with relief at the end of life, for example, even if theoretically it can hasten death. But it is all about the intention. So I hope that answers that question.
I see also a question about the future of chaplaincy. And one thing about the future of chaplaincy changed the trajectory for the last year and a half with COVID. The concept of, even in medicine, the concept of telemedicine was not very popular, or not many people were utilizing that. Today we are doing virtual chaplaincy almost on a daily basis. How are we going back to pre-COVID situation where we use the traditional approach of presence in the room? How are you going to function as a chaplain in a post-COVID situation? And the same thing as how are you functioning as a physician, Rami, in post-COVID situation?
That's a lot for my fasting brain to digest. Can you break it down? How do I serve as a chaplain to be fully present in post-COVID situations?
Are we going to, if we are unable to go back in person, let's say this coming fall, if there is a surge in COVID, meaningful? How can you function as a chaplain? Is it meaningful to do virtual chaplaincy?
I mean, certainly there are challenges and it is not ideal. There's something really impactful and meaningful about two souls being in present to one another. There's nothing like it. And I think we're all missing touch. We're all missing seeing facial gestures and smiles. We're missing just having a warm body in the room. I cannot overemphasize how important it is for somebody who is near death or actively dying that they have somebody even present in the room, even if they're not fully conscious, that there is a sense that they're not alone. And that makes such a difference in that dying process. And that's something that we try to offer as chaplains too. Certainly, we were met with these challenges in the past year, myself included, where many of the chaplaincy consults took place over the phone or over FaceTime. And it was really heartbreaking to be in the position, heartbreaking and a blessing as well, to be told by the family member on the other side of the phone tearfully, you are the only person right now who can represent me to go be with my father or be with my mother because I'm not allowed in. Could you please say this prayer for them? Could you pass this message along to them? Could you let them know this? And for me as a chaplain to write that down, to hold that, to enter into the room, to be able to whisper that to the patient, knowing that, you know, that's a amana, that's a trust that the family is entrusting you with, because I can't even imagine what it would be like in that situation. And many, many people pass in the hospital without their family members there to surround them and to love on them. We do the best we can. I say that even with the mask, the eyes are windows into the soul. And so there's a lot of expression and there's a lot of love and care that can be communicated to just the eyes. And I think this is actually quite pertinent to many patients who don't speak English who I visit, who words words and sentiments and prayers, they won't really be able to understand, but it's what's in the face and what's in the eyes that's gentle, and that gentle communication that they really receive, that's important. And if it's over the phone, Sakina actually made a beautiful video that's up on the Association of Muslim Chaplains YouTube channel, all about telechaplaincy. And in it, she emphasizes how important it is to note one's tone of voice, that when you're smiling, and speaking, like you can sense the change in the voice, right? Like even the warmth and the tone changes, to be mindful of that. So there are different techniques that we can utilize as chaplains, certainly, to be able to still communicate that compassion and that care and that presence, and offer that active listening. But certainly there is nothing like being in the same room, in the same space as somebody. So I don't think the two are interchangeable. I don't think the two can be replaced, or one could be replaced with the other, but we do the best that we can with what we have. And I think that goes for everybody as well.
Thank you, Sundus. I hope that answers the questions. Moving on to the next one is regarding, this is from my friend Renat. She's an inpatient speech therapist. And she asked, patients nearing the end of life requiring goals of care discussions regarding stopping alternative means of hydration and nutrition, accepting aspiration risk. Is there anything in Islam says about this? Or is the decision to pursue comfort care in general?
Artificial nutrition and hydration, at least here in the States, falls under the purview of a medical intervention. There was a legal case, Nancy Cruzan back in 1990, who was a young woman in a motor vehicle accident who had been dependent on artificial nutrition. And the family wanted to withdraw said intervention after some time, which would have inevitably led to her death. And there was a court case that went up to the Supreme Court where the justices did say that it did fall under the purview of medical intervention, and so much as someone either in advanced care planning or if they are cognitively intact and having the capacity to do so can withdraw artificial nutrition. Islam and Islamic bioethics, it depends, at least from what I gather, and please don't take this as gospel because I'm still reading up on this, but there are differences between different schools of thought. For example, Shia and Shia thought on this issue mirror more closely the Orthodox Jewish approach, in that once a medication, nutrition is started, the idea of withdrawing is not the same of withholding. That being said, at the end of life, and I've had a couple of lectures that I attended by bioethicists, Muslim bioethicists, where they found room to say that, yeah, because of the aspiration risk, because of medical studies, for example, in patients with advanced dementia, where the introduction of a G-tube to deliver artificial nutrition does not improve mortality. On top of that, of aspiration risk and a procedure that can carry its own risks or harms, I should say, there's also suffering that can come out of artificial nutrition at the end of life. Think about it this way. A person's body is not meant to be nutritionally sound at the end, in the last days of life. It just is opposite to what the dying process looks like. People don't eat or drink at the end of life, and that's normal for humans. And dying, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is a human process. It's not a medical process. And so I find room in withholding or even withdrawing medical artificial nutrition and hydration at the end of life if I feel that those things are present, the present of harm over benefit, present of suffering by me doing so. And of course, goals of care is paramount to what I do and how those conversations are guided at that time.
All what I can add to what Rami said is to understand it from a family perspective. Most people are afraid to make decisions at the end of life. Most people are unaware of the medical rulings, are unaware of the verses, unaware of the teachings when it comes to end of life, what can be done and what can't be done. So they look at the chaplain or look at the example of the physician. You make the decision for us out of fear that they will do or they will make a decision that will violate the teachings of the Prophet, the Quran, and the Sharia in general. So it is the fear of the families. That's why the communication is important before. And for those who are chaplains outside here, I would invite you to talk to, if your patient is Muslim, to address the issue of goals of care and end of life and post-mortem way before in any encounter that you have with the patient. To know what's important to them so we can serve. Each case is different, each diagnosis is different. So even in the presence of the fatwas, they cannot answer the context. And the context plays a big role in deciding the goals of care and how you move forward.
Can I also add one more thing to that? Oh, go ahead, Sakina, sorry.
I just added in the chat briefly on this topic, specifically on nutrition at the end of life. There is a hadith in a prophetic tradition in Sunan Ibn Majah that I often lean on this topic, where the Prophet Muhammad said, do not force your sick ones to eat or drink. Allah will feed them and give them drink. And I find that this comforts me and it comforts a lot of family members who are in that high anxiety of like, I need to feed my loved one. That there is that nourishment coming from God directly to them.
And that's why it's so important to use language. If you noticed, I don't use words like tube feeds or tube feedings because there's so much around food and feedings. If food is culture, food is love, food is being a parent, food is our best memories, food is holidays and religious gatherings. And so to equate that with a tube that's inserted to deliver a bag of, just this liquid made up of nutrients, nutrition, they're not comparable. And so I always, even if it's a mouthful, to say artificial nutrition and hydration instead of tube feeds. Even if a patient keeps referring to it as tube feeds, I go back and say artificial nutrition and hydration because I want to make sure words matter and we want to make sure that we make that difference. Because just like Kamal said, the family's perspective, they're thinking about, the love that they have. And again, feeding is how at least my mother and I'm sure many others manifest their love for the people around them.
Thank you for that discussion. Go ahead, Kamal.
We have a question about volunteers I saw in the chat. Can you address, and particularly you, Taqwa, let me introduce you to the crowd here. Taqwa is a member of the board of Ziyara. She is a chaplain at Stanford Hospital, and she was running the volunteer program at Stanford Hospital. And we have a question. What opportunities are there for people who wants to become volunteers? Spiritual care volunteers, what are your recommendations as a team here?
I would recommend connecting with spiritual care department at the particular hospital. I would recommend connecting with Ziyara for spiritual care training that maybe we could have a community-based training just to prepare people on what are being questioned from being a volunteer visiting patients in hospital. But your first bet is to connect with the spiritual care department in that particular hospital or in your local hospital, especially if you have a demography of the area that there are a lot of Muslim population in the area. I think it's also good to have this effort be coordinated with the local mosque. So it is a very community-based effort. There are differences to functioning as a volunteer in a spiritual care department and as a chaplain. I hope Sakina presentation has illustrated that there are a lot of process for one to have the title of chaplain and to be able to attend and journeying someone being sick at the hospital. But Bismillah, it is the best thing that did happen to me. And I thank God that I started my career as a chaplain, being a volunteer. Maybe I'll stop there.
If I may, I know Saad had a question earlier, and I just want to read it for Sundus, if you don't mind answering. He asks about your book, Musings of a Muslim Chaplain. Is a sheer joy to read. And his question is, how does your background in literature inform your work in pastoral care? I'm thinking of the value of storytelling and the narrative approach to pastoral care. Many thanks.
Alhamdulillah, thank you, Saad. That's very kind of you to have read it and support it. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Alhamdulillah, so glad. Alhamdulillah. Gosh, yes, very, I mean, for the sake of time, again, I can go on and on about this, but the way I think about it and the way that we're taught in CPE as chaplains is that every human being is a living human document. In other words, every person is a storybook, and they deserve to be read and studied and analyzed, but not in a prodding way, but in a really beautiful way, to be able to know the beginnings of them and the present and look to the future as well. And so approaching each person as a story unfolding and ourselves as stories unfolding yet, where our ending is not yet known, places the chaplain in a really special position to be able to make meaning out of that. And so as I'm listening to somebody who's sharing their story with me and trusting me with that, there's a lot of reading between the lines that I do as well as a chaplain, to look for things that aren't said. And I wrote also recently about the similarities between our stories and our life journeys unfolding compared to the way the Quran, our holy text, unfolds, where it's not linear. There's no clear beginning, middle, and end. When we talk about our life stories, maybe we'll start at the very beginning when we were born, but we'll jump to something in our childhood and then connect it to something else and then go back to something else. And that really this story is like a puzzle where it deserves to be listened to in its entirety and then begin over and over and over again. Every time you listen, you will hear something new. And so I see that as unfolding from our journey when we journey with the Quran and also with people, that it's very similar. So we're reading these narratives in that really a more fuller way. And so thank you for your question. Yes, there's definitely overlap there. And I always wondered, having the degree in English and creative writing, I took 10 years off where I had both my kids very close in age, and we were moving, and my husband was in grad school. And I got so much pressure from my in-laws and my parents, like, when are you gonna go back to school and do something with your life? And I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know how my love for stories and storytelling and my love for multi-faith and my love for my religion and spirituality were all going to converge until I actually met a Muslim chaplain, Chaplain Sahib Sultan, Allah yarhamu, Allah have mercy on his soul, who passed away recently. And just seeing him and being able to hear about his experiences in chaplaincy and seeing his state and how calm and loving and gentle he was, he reminded me so much of those prophetic qualities that I was hooked instantly. I was like, where do I start signing up? And so it's very interesting now to look back and see the ways in which God has kind of interwoven all of these pieces of my life prior to chaplaincy, and now they come together so beautifully in the work that I'm honored to be able to do this time. Alhamdulillah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for your support.
Case-to-case question was, what's the acceptable common ground between Muslim gender rules and non-gender binary, transgender medical providers, chaplains, and I'm a non-gender binary chaplain encountering a devoted Sunni family struggling with mother dying from COVID. They precisely requested a female Muslim practitioner visit bedside. We provided whatever we could do for them, and I'm still wondering what we could do better. First of all, Kiski, I want to just acknowledge, thank you very much for wanting to do, for the desire to do better for them and providing support in the way that you have already. I want to respond to this, I think, going back to a lot of what we said earlier, which is, what is that specific need and request and sensitivities coming from that specific patient? And it may not be anything about gender, it may just be a personal preference. Even I myself, as a Muslim chaplain, female, sometimes the Muslim patients want a male chaplain and they don't want me in that room for whatever reason. So the focus again is what feels comforting to them. And I think your presence, being there and being calm and compassionate in trying to accommodate their request. And at the same time, I think we also have to be clear with boundaries and limitations and the availabilities in hospitals. Most hospitals just have a few chaplains or a handful of chaplains, and the patient may request somebody from their specific religious background that's not available, a specific gender that might not be available, a specific subdivision of their religion that might not be available. And so the way we communicate to them our role as interfaith, as inter-everything, and this is currently the resource available in the hospital, and I'm happy to accompany you. And if that's not what's supportive to you, that's okay. And to just be, sometimes I feel like the best spiritual care is in the way that I withdraw. If my presence, for whatever reason, doesn't feel supportive to that person or that family, then the way I withdraw is gives them a certain dignity, gives them a certain honor in having that choice. I think most patients, the only choice they have in the hospital is whether they receive a chaplain's visit or not. They often cannot decline a doctor's visit or a nurse visit. Those are not really optional visits. But they do have some sense of autonomy when it comes to spiritual care visit, and then the way I withdraw. And also, what was the one last thing? I lost my last thought, but yeah, thank you for
maybe I can say I can say something. I was wondering if as the mother is dying, they want someone Muslim who can help do the shahada or whisper the shahada to the dying person. And maybe that's the Muslim part question. Mm-hmm. Maybe last question from the group. Anything? There is a question from Omar who asked, individuals who are not chaplains or not in that oath. We don't really take an oath, Omar, but a personal oath, yes. But who still want to serve, I guess, in a role, what would be appropriate? How do
Are we answering that?
Mm-hmm.
Kamal, did you want to answer it?
Well, number one, no, Umar, organizations like Ziyara Spiritual Care would welcome you. You are one of the community leaders, and many are like you outside there who can be advocates for whether be it from those who experience the gift of receiving care, or if their loved ones received care from a chaplain, that they can be advocates. the word chaplaincy is really giving not a bad name, but it does not resonate with anything from our tradition. So some people might understand that this is not something has to do with Islam. So it's the storytelling. Tell the story of chaplaincy, the gift of care that you receive, and anyone out there who received the gift of chaplaincy within your own circles. And it's a matter of education. We keep educating our own community about what are the best ways to support our patients and our loved ones in different contexts, and how can we support ourselves too. So the chaplain is a counselor. We offer our services to everyone. So you can be an ambassador out there if you're not taking the oath to become a chaplain. Promote the work of chaplaincy and referrals. If you know someone who is in need and in need of support, one of the aspects of chaplaincy that appeals to many, that the non-judgment approach, that you'll be talking to someone who will not going to be judging you, and the confidentiality part of it, that we are here to, again, listen to one another. So again, financial support will be always great to sponsor someone to become a chaplain and to sponsor the work of chaplaincy. So you craft the level of support that is comfortable and meaningful to you. Thank you, Omar, for joining. Any last thoughts, Rami, Sundus, Sakina, before we say thank you to everyone here? That has been a great joy to have all of you. I would like to thank Dr. Rami Salah, Chaplain Sundus Khulaqi, and Chaplain Sakina Al-Habshi, and behind the scenes Chaplain Taqwa and Nargis, who's members of the board of Ziyara, who are present today, and the international Ziyara board members who are joining us today from different parts of the world. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in the next program. And happy Mother's Day to everyone out there. It's the 27th day of Ramadan, so early Eid Mubarak greetings to all of you. May Allah give you the blessings for this month and heal this community, heal the world of this pandemic, and we'll see you at another program for Ziyara. Thank you so much.
Yeah. يا رب اللهم هذا مقام العائذين بك الضارعين إليك. اللهم لك صمنا وعلى رزقك أفطرنا. اللهم أهل علينا شهر رمضان بالأمن والإيمان، وأدخله علينا بالبركة والتقوى والتوفيق لما تحب وترضى. اللهم إنا نوينا صوم رمضان فأعنا على وفائه وارزقنا خيره. اللهم إنا نحتسب لوجهك صومه فبارك لنا ثوابه. اللهم أكرمتنا فبلغناه، فامنن علينا فيه بقبول الطاعات والقربات، وارحمنا فيه بمغفرة الزلات، إنك على كل شيء قدير. رمضان أقبل بعد طول حنين، فيه الهدى كتاب الله أتلو كتاب الله فيه تبتلا أتلو كتاب الله فيه تبتلا آياته قدسية تهديني وأقول يا ربي بحقك فاهدني وأقول يا ربي بحقك فاهدني لرضاك إن رضا الإله يقيني. ربنا آمنا فاغفر لنا وارحمنا وأنت خير الراحمين. من ضياء القرآن الكريم أبو جرير.